Hello, I'm Mitchell McKinney, Dean of the University of Akron's Buchtel College of Arts and Sciences. As part of our monthly series, Dialogue with the Dean, I visit with members of our college's outstanding faculty to learn more about their research and creative activity. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Greg Wilson, Distinguished Professor of History. Recently, Dr. Wilson, along with his co-author, Dr. Kevin Kern, also a professor in the Department of History at UA, published a second edition of Ohio, A History of the Buckeye State. This book, which is the most widely used textbook in college history courses throughout the state, surveys the long and rich history of this great state, from its earliest geological periods to the present day. Dr. Wilson, congratulations on the second edition of your book, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So first, I'm just curious, as one who perhaps knows more about the history of Ohio than anyone else, when and how did you decide that you would focus your scholarly attention on exploring and explaining the history of this state?
Well, it started when I was a grad student. Part of my dissertation dealt with Ohio, and so when I interviewed for the job here, one of the requirements was being able to take over the rich tradition of teaching Ohio history at UA. George Nepper had taught the course for years and years and years, and his book was the main book for Ohio history. And so when I came here for the interview, that was something they asked me about, and of course I was excited to do it. And so I've been doing that now for the last 20-something years since I've been here.
Wow. So in addition to Ohio history, your scholarship focuses also on recent U.S. history and public history. So why do you think Ohio's history is so integral to understanding the broader story of our nation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the themes we do in the book and what I do when I teach the course is I talk about how Ohio has been central to so many movements, larger histories outside of state history. So if you think about national story, or even a global story, Ohio is at the center of so much of that. And so that's something we carry through the book. So if we go from the earliest pre-contact period through the 18th, 19th centuries up until the present, so many of Ohio's stories are also America's stories or global stories. And so that's always exciting to me to be able to teach that and write about that. And I know students are always surprised when we go over that, and they say, I had no idea that Ohio was this important to this or that thing. So I feel that just thinking about Ohio as a state allows us to think also about kind of national and global stories at the same time. Yeah.
So now my next question is perhaps a bit unfair, and it's much like asking a parent which is their favorite child. Right. But from a book that spans Ohio's prehistory all the way to 2020. If you had to pull out your top 3 favorite moments or events in Ohio history, what would those be?
That's tough, right? There's so many. So I'll twist the question a little bit. I've been thinking about it, and I'll talk about maybe 3 people that can help us get insight into 3 eras or 3 moments. So one of the first I can think about would be the Shawnee leader, Blue Jacket. Blue Jacket we're not really sure where or when he was born, but he was certainly an Ohioan Shawnee leader, and he was instrumental in the Shawnee being able to create an alliance, a confederacy, to resist British and American invasion into Shawnee country, into Ohio country. And so he is at the center of so many of the conflicts of that era. We're talking middle to late 1700s. And he's known for his fierce resistance, but he's somebody who also was not immune to taking in new ideas from the Americans, from the Europeans, and adopting them in the way that he saw fit. So in one of the things we talk about in the book and when I teach is seeing Ohio as a middle ground in a cultural but also a geographic sense in that moment. And Blue Jacket is one of those people who we can see that middle ground at work in the way he acted, the way he thought in his life. And so he's, to me, a really interesting character from that period. Moving forward into, say, the 19th century, Victoria Woodhull is another interesting person. She was born in a small town in Ohio. She came to fame being an advocate for many causes at that point in the 1880s, 1890s, which were considered radical. So women's suffrage, labor rights, black rights, freedom of divorce. And so she was a fascinating character for the press to write about, but she was also ahead of her time and a leader in so many ways in that movement in the 19th century for social reform and social justice. She's also interesting because she went on to be with her sister, who was Tennessee, Clayton was their name. Her and her sister were the first women to have a Wall Street firm, investment firm. And that's because Victoria was also into spiritualism. She advertised herself as a clairvoyant, and she got into good graces with Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the most famous sort of robber barons of the era, and advised him on spiritual matters, but also financial matters, apparently. And it must have worked well because he funded her investment as in a Wall Street firm, which she ran with her sister. So she's just an interesting character in a lot of ways. And then I think in the 20th century, let's say, I think of someone like Toni Morrison, right, who's born in Lorain, Ohio, who came to fame through her editing work, but then, of course, being the renowned literary person that she is, Nobel Prize winner, Jefferson Medal, all of those things. And she really was able to tell, I think, that story of that sort of middle to later part of the 20th century when we think about things like human rights, civil rights, but also in her literature reflecting back on the question of slavery in the United States and Ohio's place in that big story too. So she's a fascinating and interesting figure in a lot of ways. So those are my three that I come up with.
Wow, and quite fascinating. Who knew a history book could be so interesting and engaging? Now, my final question, which may be somewhat anathema to a historian, is as we think ahead to a future edition, whether that's the next 10, 20, 30 years, can you forecast what narrative or chapter that you might be telling about the history of Ohio? I know that's a bit unusual as historians typically look back, but looking ahead.
Right, we always look back, not ahead, right? No, I think it's a good question because we, having just recently done the second edition, we had to think about, what had changed since the first edition. And so it was interesting in the first part of Ohio history, the pre-contact period, there'd been a lot of new research. And so we really had to revamp that chapter especially. And then the last chapter, right? What's been happening recently in the last, say, 10 years. So in that chapter, I think went through the most revision. So of the two, it was the first and the last. So thinking ahead, like to the next possible edition, if it comes out, I think probably, in that early period where there's a lot of new exciting finds in archaeology and anthropology in the pre-contact period, because it's a period we know the least about, and we're learning more almost every day. And then I think obviously in the last chapter, which gets us to whatever the present is, there's going to be probably a lot of things we'll have to add on and change as we have moved forward. Even in the last couple of years, things have changed quite a bit. And so I think when we think ahead, figuring out where the Ohio story is in that moment and how that story in the present can still connect, if it can, to the past.
Wow. So with discoveries, history really is never set.
It's never set. There's always something new, whether it's a new finding in an archive or a new, as I said, new archaeological evidence, or just new interpretations of old evidence, right? We're always changing how we approach it and how we tell that narrative, either in books or if we're teaching the course.
Wow. Well, Dr. Wilson, it's been fun talking Ohio history with you and learning a great deal. And congratulations on the publication of the second edition. And at some point, we look forward to the next edition and learning more. So thanks for joining us today on Dialogue with the Dean.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.